So yesterday we looked into a couple of verses from the third chapter of Genesis. Today we're going to leap ahead about 45 books in the Bible and respond to a few lines from the Gospel of John. Here they are. So the disciples said to him, "What sign are you going to give to us then, so that we may see it and believe you? What work are you performing? Our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Then Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." They said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." So we're moving in our liturgical calendars toward the Last Supper, Holy Thursday. This is one of those years where our calendar lines up pretty neatly with the Jewish calendar. The Jewish calendar is moving towards Passover. So as we turn toward the Last Supper, to the Passover Seder, I want to talk a little bit about food. I think it's not a gross exaggeration to say that the Bible is a culinary manual. It's concerned from start to finish about how to eat, what to eat, when to eat, who to eat with. Food is the first way the Bible shows us that God intends to provide for humanity. All those seed-bearing plants and trees with fruit that God gives to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to eat. And food is, of course, also the Bible's shorthand for all the ways that we have moved away from God. It's shorthand for our disobedience. Adam and Eve ate the wrong thing in the wrong way. And ever after Adam and Eve make that erroneous eating, ever after the beginning of Genesis, the biblical writers often discuss people's relationship with God in culinary terms. So the dietary codes of the Old Testament show us the ways that God is deeply involved in the ordinary daily details of people's lives. Also in Scripture, food carries memory, and food will become on Holy Thursday at the Last Supper a sacramental vessel. Jesus instructs his friends and his followers to eat a ritual meal in his memory. And then finally, there's this weird language that we just got at in the Gospel of John, where we're invited to think of God's own self as food. My flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. The living bread is my flesh, says Jesus, and his audience in the Gospel of John is sort of baffled. I once asked a circle of people from my church, if Jesus is the bread of life, what kind of bread is he? Not a one of them said he's that small round wafer that we use at communion. I wrote down the answers they did give. I think these answers make a pretty good prayer. When asked what kind of bread Jesus, the bread of life, is, they said a bagel, rye toast with jam, morning glory muffins, chocolate tea bread, rosemary ciabatta, my grandmother's sourdough, my grandmother's challah, French toast, a crusty baguette. To think of God as bread, to think of God's flesh as our bread, is foremost to think about God providing for our needs. And for people who have lived with hunger, this is a vivid and palpable illustration. But I have to say that I've never been hungry for more than about an hour and a half. And I know in my own life, I take sustenance for granted. So for me, and maybe for many of you, the notion of God providing bread as merely a notion of God providing for our needs, for some of us that might seem a bit ho-hum. And one of the reasons I like this list of ciabatta and chocolate tea bread and French toast is that it expands our attention from the usual thought, if God's body is our bread, then God meets our needs. It expands us to also thinking about the category of enjoyment and delectation and pleasure. If God is chocolate tea bread, God is not only about provision, God is also about delight. So some mornings when I notice that I have yet again turned Jesus into an abstraction, I take that bread list down from my bulletin board and I sit down with it and I really try to pray that list. I try to picture and smell the French toast and the toast with jam. I picture my stepmother's challah. I ask God to cultivate my yearning for God and to help make this day a day on which I will taste and see that the Lord is good and taste and see that the Lord is sweet. Yesterday, I ate my first ever waffle from the waffle shop, and I think I'm going to add that to my prayer. Jesus as a Calvary Lenten waffle. Now, I have to admit that, of course, Jesus didn't specifically identify in the biblical text with a Calvary Lenten waffle or with my stepmother's challah. Jesus identifies with manna. His disciples say, our forefathers ate manna in the desert. What miraculous thing are you going to do to help us know that you are who you say you are? And Jesus says, it's not Moses who gave that manna, it is my Father who gives the true bread from heaven. So Jesus is comparing and contrasting himself with manna, manna of course being the food that God provided for Israel while they wandered in the desert for 40 years. The book of Exodus tells us that manna was like coriander seed, which doesn't actually help me because I don't know what coriander seed is like, but like coriander seed white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. And the book of Numbers says manna was like cakes baked with oil. I admit I've always pictured manna as looking kind of like those coconut flakes that you buy for baking. The rabbis reading these descriptions of manna in the Bible add something to the biblical description. The rabbis say that manna in fact tasted like whatever the Israelites wanted it to taste like on a given day. So if you were craving chocolate that day, your manna would taste like chocolate ganache, derby pie. If your palate was set for something savory, the manna might taste like broccoli quiche or mushroom crepes. I really like this rabbinic teaching, and I like to think that it lurks underneath Jesus's identification with manna. Jesus doesn't just taste like honeyed wafers. Jesus tastes like morning glory muffins or chocolate tea bread or whatever you desire on a given day. In Scripture, of course, God is the meal. God's flesh is the bread on which we feast. But God also provides the meal over and over in Scripture, not just the fruit and trees for Adam and Eve, and not just manna in the wilderness, the psalmist tells us that God prepares tables for us in the presence of our enemies. And Jesus tells us that God feeds even the ravens. And of course, Jesus himself provides wedding guests with wine and feeds the 5,000. And after the resurrection, he gives his friends a beachside breakfast of fish and bread. One book I read said he's really giving them bruschetta, which I like. Over and over, the scriptures seem to take great pains, go to great lengths to show us that God really is the one who fills up the hungry with good things. I wonder what it feels like to God to do all that food providing. I myself enjoy little more than getting into the kitchen for a few hours on a late afternoon and cooking up a storm, and so I wonder if God enjoys providing all these banquets for us. Maybe God feeds us not just because what a God generically does is provide, but maybe God gets something out of it also. Maybe providing food makes God feel, as it sometimes makes me feel, needed and important. Maybe God feels a sense of accomplishment, stepping back from a table laden with food, taking deep satisfaction in all of that finest wheat and honey and manna. I also wonder if God ever feels crazily possessive of God's kitchen, as I sometimes feel about mine. Sometimes when I think about God feeding us, I remember my mother. My mother would come home, a single mother coming home from a long day at work, and she just flat out would not have the energy to cook. So she would microwave herself a bag of popcorn, and she would open a can of Chef Boyardee for me and microwave that too. Now, I can imagine one might think that's not a picture of food provision that has anything to do with God, that has anything to do with the God who wants to provide for us so abundantly, the God who made all of those trees and fruiting things in the Garden of Eden. But it seems to me that that picture of my mother and her microwave are in their way a picture of God's provision for us, exactly because God became incarnate. And therefore God knew exhaustion and finitude. And also we know about our God that God has a preference for those people with no margins in their lives. And so I like to imagine that out of solidarity, God sometimes just hands around a can of SpaghettiOs to the saints. Two more pictures of food provision that maybe shed some light on what Jesus is getting at when he identifies himself as our food, his flesh as our bread. And these images do not come from my childhood or my life. They come from books I've read. Most of my life is reading, so maybe in that way they are coming from my life. I do a lot of reading in my kitchen. I have a brown leather chair in the corner of my kitchen. And recently I sat in that chair and I read a wonderful monograph by a scholar named Psyche Williams Forson. The monograph is called Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, and it is about the many uses, from money-making to self-expression, that African American women have put to cooking chicken. It's an awesome book. Chapter 4 of that book is about food and travel. And in that chapter, Williams Forson recovers the history of Black women packing up shoebox lunches for family members who were setting off on a trip. She draws in her chapter on a cookbook memoir by two sisters, Norma Jean Darden and Carol Darden. Their cookbook memoir is called Spoon Bread and Strawberry Wine. And in that book, the Darden sisters recall how excited they were as little girls to stay up late the night before a trip. They got to stay up late and help their mother pack up the box lunches that they would take on their trip. These shoe boxes contained just infinite seeming culinary goodness, fried chicken and peanut butter and jelly and deviled eggs and chocolate layer cake and nuts and raisins and a thermos of lemonade, and everything was neatly wrapped in wax paper, they remember, and tucked into these shoe boxes, and they just loved these nighttime shoebox lunch preparations. But even as young girls, the Darden sisters knew that these shoebox lunches were about traversing dangerous terrain. They wrote, "These trips took place during the 50s, and one never knew what dangers or insults would be encountered along the way. Racist policies loomed like unidentified monsters in our childish imagination and in reality. After the New Jersey Turnpike ended, we would have to be on alert for the unexpected. So as we approached that last Howard Johnson's before Delaware, our father would make his inevitable announcement that we had to get out, stretch our legs, and go to the bathroom whether we wanted to or not. For this was the last restaurant along the route that didn't offer segregated facilities. From this point on, we pulled out our trusty shoebox lunches." I've come to think that that picture of Mrs. Darden staying up late to prepare those box lunches for her family, that picture is one of the best pictures we can have of God feeding us. It's a good picture of God preparing food for the Israelites who are journeying in the wilderness. God is not just abstractly raining coriander flakes down from the heavens. God is staying up late to prepare shoebox lunches for people who are on a perilous journey. And that is exactly the bread with which Jesus most explicitly identified in the Gospel of John, with manna, with journeying bread, with those shoebox lunches of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and deviled eggs and chocolate cake, all carefully packed into a small box. The bread that Jesus is for us is exactly the bread that sustains oppressed people on their journey through dangerous terrain. Here's one more picture to put next to that one. In the Middle Ages, several female mystics compared the soul in union with God to bread that soaks up honey and grows engorged with the honey that it soaks up. One of the women who used that bread and honey image was a 13th century Saxon mystic named Mechthild, and she had two visions about honey. In her first vision, she was shown a picture of Mary cradling the infant Jesus, and weirdly, Jesus had his own name written across his torso in honey. And then in a later vision, Jesus came to Mechthild, and he asks her to place all of her pains and adversities in his left hand. And he says that if she does this, her pains and adversities will be sweetened by union with him, just as a crumb dipped in a pot of honey takes on the honey's fragrance. I think that's a reverse communion image. Usually, at the Eucharist, at the Lord's Supper, usually we draw near to God by opening our hands and receiving a crumb of bread. But in Mechthild's vision, we draw near to God and find God's hand open to us. So I like picturing Mechthild and Mrs. Darden and the people in my parish and even myself. I like picturing us moving toward Jesus, sidling up to Jesus, placing our crumbs of pain and adversity in his hands, knowing, trusting that if we do that, they will soak up his honey. So those are some of the pictures that I will be carrying into Holy Week. Those are some of the pictures I will carry into Holy Thursday, the day on which we will, in a most focused way, remember Jesus giving that strange instruction to ever after eat him. I'll be carrying the picture of God and God's SpaghettiOs, and of Mrs. Darden's shoebox lunches, and also of the Lord's open hand, open and ready to receive our pains and adversities and convert them into something sweet. And I'll even carry those pictures down to lunch in a minute, because somehow all of this is mysteriously applicable even when we're not at a formal Eucharist. I really believe that lunch at the waffle shop is a Eucharist of sorts. It is an experience of abundance. It is an experience of food seeming to magically appear. And it's an experience of breaking bread together. It's a small midweek invitation to surrender our presumption that we feed ourselves and to allow ourselves the gracious experience of being fed by the God who strangely declares, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry."